In 1972, a group of researchers at one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, MIT, concluded that society as we know it was on track to collapse by the year 2040. At the time, this prediction was met with skepticism, debate, and in many corners of the corporate and political world, outright dismissal. It was easy to dismiss because 2040 felt like a lifetime away. It was a distant point on the horizon, a problem for future generations to solve. But time has a funny way of catching up with us. Decades have passed. We have lived through the turn of the millennium, the dawn of the internet age, and a global pandemic. And recently, a follow-up study conducted by analysts at the major accounting firm KPMG decided to revisit that old, dusty prediction. They didn't just want to see if the original math held up. They wanted to see where we currently stand on the timeline. What they found was chilling. They found that we are not just on track, we are ahead of schedule. To understand the gravity of this situation, we first need to pull back and look at the timeline of human history. Advanced human civilizations have existed for, at most, about 10,000 years. In the grand scheme of the planet, that is a blink of an eye. But in that short time, many great empires rose from absolutely nothing. They built sprawling cities, developed complex trade networks, and commanded armies that shook the earth. And then, almost all of them returned to nothing. They left behind little more than artifacts buried in the dirt and crumbling architecture that tourists take photos of today. When we look at these fallen empires, whether it's Rome, the Maya, or the dynasties of China, it is often hard for historians to definitively say what caused any of these particular collapses. Was it war? Was it famine? Was it disease? Usually, the determining factors tend to fall into four broad categories: political issues, social and cultural instability, environmental degradation, and of course, the one that drives almost everything else: economic issues. Any civilization that has been reduced to little more than an entry in a history textbook fell through some lethal combination of these four factors. The speed of the collapse varies wildly. Some were almost instantaneous. Look at the great city of Pompeii, a bustling hub of Roman life that succumbed to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in a matter of hours. It was there, and then it was gone. Some took a few weeks or months, like the Aztec Empire, which collapsed after 93 days of brutal resistance against the Spanish and the invisible army of smallpox they brought with them. And some took centuries. 300 years separate the absolute height of the Roman Empire from its eventual final whimper. This slow decline is perhaps the most dangerous kind because when you are living through it, it doesn't feel like a collapse. It just feels like life getting slightly harder year after year until the structure can no longer hold. This brings us to today. Our modern civilization is arguably the greatest ever known. We are hundreds of thousands of times wealthier and more advanced than even the most massive empires of history could have possibly imagined. If you are consuming this content right now, you have access to the internet. And if you have access to the internet, you have access to a source of knowledge that scholars, philosophers, and kings could not have dreamt of just 100 years ago. The Library of Alexandria pales in comparison to the device you likely have in your pocket. The same is true for other modern luxuries that we have completely taken for granted. We have climate control that allows us to live in deserts and frozen tundras comfortably. We have worldwide travel that can take us to the other side of the globe in less than a day. We have cheap and effective clothing, miraculous medicine that has doubled our life expectancy, instantaneous communication with anyone anywhere, plentiful and safe food, water on tap, and even little luxuries like being able to listen to your favorite song pretty much whenever you feel like it. People often ask, who was the richest person in history? Was it Rockefeller? Was it the Rothschilds? Was it the Romanovs? Or maybe Mansa Musa, the African king who supposedly traveled with so much gold he inflated the economies of the cities he visited? Sure, they were rich for their time, but their time was one of almost universal poverty, disease, and discomfort. Despite their relative wealth, they couldn't dream of the amenities that you think nothing of. Let's be honest. If I had the choice between a modern rented two-bedroom apartment with Wi-Fi, a flushing toilet, and Uber Eats, versus a sprawling 15th century French palace with no air conditioning, no plumbing, and food that might give me cholera, I would take the apartment 10 out of 10 times. You would be a fool if you didn't do the same. The quality of life for the average person today, in terms of comfort and safety, exceeds that of the emperors of old. And I haven't even mentioned war yet. Despite what most people might think based on their daily diet of cable news, doom scrolling on social media, and the front page of Reddit, we are actually living through one of the most peaceful periods in human history. Overwhelmingly, this has all been thanks to a combination of technology, widespread education, and global economic cooperation. Even nations that have resentful hostilities bubbling away beneath the surface, countries that theoretically hate each other, are more dependent on one another today than even the closest of allies were back in the time of Napoleon. Why get hostile and bomb your customer when you can sell to them and get rich? It sounds vapid, it sounds capitalist, but it is generally a good thing for keeping the peace. However, this interconnectedness is a double-edged sword. It is a fickle piece. Comparing our modern global economy to even the greatest empires throughout history is like comparing a modern jet engine to a donkey. That is not hyperbole. That is literally how far ahead we are today in terms of complexity. But this complexity is actually the problem. Sure, a jet engine is faster, more powerful, and more impressive than a donkey, but it is significantly less resilient. A donkey can trip, fall into a ditch, get back up, and keep walking. It is robust. A jet engine? One tiny flaw, one loose screw in its incredibly complex network of interdependent components, and the whole thing can explode mid-air. The donkey survives the stumble. The jet engine does not survive the glitch. What's worse is that our system moves so fast and flies so high that even the slightest hiccup becomes catastrophic. Most of us alive today, and especially those of us sitting at home consuming digital content, would not know how to survive very long if the jet engine stopped. If we didn't have food within easy reach, sometimes literally delivered to our door by a stranger, how long would we last? We have traded resilience for efficiency. We have traded self-sufficiency for convenience. I know what you're thinking. I am starting to sound like some kind of deranged doomsday prepper screaming "the end is nigh" on a street corner. But I am not basing this on intuition or conspiracy theories. I am basing this on data. So let's break down exactly how this MIT study from 1972 predicted that society would collapse. What metrics were they looking at? What did these metrics tell us about the structural weaknesses of our jet engine? And finally, is the fact that this report is ahead of schedule actually something to be worried about, or is this all just a case of too much weight being given to statistical correlations? The report, titled "The Limits to Growth," set out to primarily explore a simple but terrifying question: is our current usage of the world's resources sustainable? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The study was actually one of the first economic studies ever to use computers sporting dynamic, systematic models. Now, I'm not a computer scientist, and there are plenty of people who could explain what system dynamics are far better than I can. But in brief, it is basically a method of using software to replicate the workings of complex real-life systems. It tries to simulate how the world actually works, not just how we think it works. It sounds very familiar to us today in the age of AI and machine learning. But remember, this was taking place back in the 1960s and 70s. Computers looked like room-sized refrigerators and had about as much processing power as your electric kettle. Despite these hardware limitations, the MIT team eventually created a program called World 3. This was a computer model for the entire global economy, This piece of software modeled everything from variable population growth to industrial capacity. Crucially, it modeled how everything would interact with one another. This interaction is the key. In traditional economics, we often like to isolate variables. We say, ceteris paribus, or all other things being equal. For example, if we tax soda, the price goes up and demand goes down, assuming nothing else changes. But in the real world, nothing ever remains the same. Everything is connected. A large population is naturally going to require more resources, more food, more water, more homes, more of everything. But a larger population will also naturally lead to more innovation. We have a much better chance of finding a Tesla, a Da Vinci, a Fritz Haber, or a Frank Whittle with a population of 8 billion than we do with a population of 2 billion, which is where the world was just 100 years ago. The World 3 program tried to account for this chaos. It had systems for modeling everything from birth rates to farming technology. The central idea was that all of these variables were very important to maintaining the modern lifestyle that we enjoy today. But because they interact with one another, they were prone to feedback loops. The idea of a feedback loop actually comes from audio engineering. If you have ever held a microphone up to a loudspeaker, you will know the horrible, ear-piercing, high-pitched screech that comes out of it. That happens because the microphone hears a sound, sends it to the speaker. The speaker amplifies it, and then the microphone hears that louder sound and amplifies it again. It loops and loops until the system overloads. The same kind of effect can happen in economies and societies. For example, take declining birth rates. Fewer babies might seem good for resource consumption in the short term, but in the long term, it leads to an aging population. An aging population puts immense financial pressure on the smaller group of younger workers to care for the elderly, either directly by caring for them at home or indirectly through high taxes to fund pension schemes and health care. This financial pressure means those younger workers have less money, less time, and less optimism to start families of their own. So, they have fewer children, which leads to an even smaller generation next time, which leads to even more pressure. That is a feedback loop. And once a feedback loop starts, it is incredibly difficult to stop. While the MIT study accounted for hundreds of variables in its computer-generated model, it was fundamentally interested in tracking 5 big ones: population, industrial output, food production, available resources, and pollution. It's worth remembering that this report was published in 1972. This was before climate change was more than a blip on the scientific community's radar. It was far from being the widely recognized existential crisis it is today. Chances are, if the paper were replicated today, it would heavily factor in average global temperatures and carbon parts per million. But even without explicitly modeling global warming, the results were dire. Let's look at how these variables dance together. Let's go back to the economist's safe space for a second and assume all other things are equal outside of food and population. These variables are obviously dependent on one another. If one moves, the other will too. But the order matters. What sounds like a more concerning order of events? A decline in population leading to a decline in food production, or a decline in food production leading to a decline in population? Obviously, the second one is the nightmare scenario. That's famine. That's starvation. That's collapse. So, knowing how the machine worked, what did it actually predict? Like good scientists, the researchers hedged their bets. They knew that predicting the future exactly is a fool's errand. They could have published their paper on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday, someone could have invented a commercially viable cold fusion reactor, rendering all their energy assumptions obsolete. The researchers realized this. So instead of giving one single prophecy, they tweaked the initial conditions and ran the simulation over and over again to create a range of scenarios. In some simulations, they would assume that innovation remains at a constant pace, that we keep inventing things at the rate we do now. In other simulations, they would assume that technological innovation continues to compound on itself, meaning things like harvesting resources from asteroids or growing meat in laboratories become reality very quickly. And then in other simulations, they would assume that technological progress would slowly plateau. A quick side note on the technological plateau. That might not sound very realistic to us today. We have grown up in a time of constant, dizzying innovation. Moore's law has held true for 5 decades, doubling computing power every 2 years. But we are starting to reach the physical limits of how many transistors we can pack onto a silicon chip before quantum physics starts messing things up. We are seeing diminishing returns. A lot of technological innovation these days isn't about solving hunger or energy, it's just major tech companies finding new and innovative ways for you to waste time while consuming advertiser content. So the idea that technology might not save us is a variable we have to take seriously. The researchers ran models with lower birth rates, higher recycling, more resource discoveries, more global trade, and less global trade. They basically tried to account for every outcome that would be possible with a realistic combination of factors. They then averaged out the trajectories to see where humanity would end up. As you would suspect from a range of models, they got a range of different results. But they all sort of had one terrifying thing in common. Almost all of the models showed a significant decline in our way of life around the year 2040. The researchers categorized these outcomes into 3 main scenarios that fit within the standard deviation. The first and potentially most optimistic outcome was called the comprehensive technology scenario. This was a model where we continued to live like we currently do today, consuming, building, growing, but technology progressed fast enough to ensure our productive capacity was able to keep up. In this world, we invent our way out of trouble. We solve the energy crisis with fusion. We solve the resource crisis with perfect recycling. We solve the food crisis with synthetic biology. The model still predicts a dip in food production due to pollution, but it gets addressed. Population stabilizes around 2040 not because of starvation, but because wealthier urban populations naturally choose to have fewer children. Industrial output peaks and declines. But not because we are poor, but because we become so efficient that we don't need to make as much stuff. If we have self-driving cars that never crash and can be shared, we need fewer cars. This leads to a dematerialization of the economy. This wouldn't be a terrible outcome. It's the Star Trek future. The second scenario is the stabilized world. This is the scenario where humanity collectively wakes up. We decide to maintain our current rate of innovation, but also invest heavily into renewable energy, recycling, and social services. We voluntarily limit our industrial output before it destroys the planet. We choose stability over growth. It looks very similar to the comprehensive technology outcome, but the mechanism is different. It's driven by policy and human choice rather than just raw technological magic. This was what the researchers identified as the most optimistic and sustainable path. And then, there is the third scenario, the one that kept the researchers up at night, the one they dubbed business as usual. In the business as usual model, we don't change. We don't voluntarily cut back. We don't get a miraculous technological savior. We just keep prioritizing GDP growth above all else. We keep burning fossil fuels until they run out or kill us. We keep expanding agriculture until the soil turns to dust. In this model, the collapse is clear and brutal. Here is the timeline the computer spit out for this scenario. First, pollution continues to increase exponentially. It poisons the water and the soil. Then, because the easy-to-reach resources are gone, the cost of extraction skyrockets. We have to spend more energy just to get energy. This sucks capital away from other sectors. Industrial output stalls because it's too expensive to make things. Then, agriculture fails. The soil is degraded, the water is polluted, and we can't afford the fertilizer. food production crashes, and finally, the population line on the graph falls off a cliff. Famines in poor countries, declining birth rates, and chaos in rich countries. By all accounts, this is the collapse of modern civilization. I said at the beginning that I would rather be a middle-class worker today than a king from 150 years ago. But if the business-as-usual model plays out, the reverse becomes true. I would rather be a middle-class worker today than a king just 20 years in the future. That is a genuinely scary thought. So here is the trillion-dollar question. Which path are we on? We have had 50 years since the original report. We have 50 years of real-world data to check against the model. And that is exactly what Gaia Harrington at KPMG did. She took the data on population, industrial output, food, and pollution from 1972 to 2021 and overlaid it onto the MIT charts. The result? The data tracks the business-as-usual model with frightening accuracy. We are not on the Star Trek path. We are not on the stabilized world path. We are following the curve of the collapse almost perfectly. In fact, on some metrics, like pollution and inequality, we are actually ahead of schedule. This is a model that highlights a very clear collapse. It suggests that we are currently standing at the peak of human prosperity, looking down into a deep valley. If the model holds true, the next decade will define the future of our species. Now, before you panic and run to the woods, it is important to address the criticisms of this model. A study that basically amounts to a computer screaming, "The world is going to end," is naturally going to be met with cynics. Critics point out that the model has a very pessimistic view of human innovation. They argue that the model underestimates our ability to adapt. They say, necessity is the mother of invention. As soon as humanity's back is against the wall, we tend to fight back. We are already seeing this with the explosion of renewable energy technologies. Solar and wind are cheaper than coal now. That wasn't predicted in 1972. Maybe, just maybe, we can push ourselves from the business-as-usual track onto the comprehensive technology track at the last second. We are trying to fix the jet engine while it is still flying at 30,000 feet. It is dangerous, it is terrifying, but it is not impossible. Best case scenario? This was all massively overblown. The model was too simple, and we will continue to thrive, proving the computer wrong. Worst case scenario. The computer was right. The feedback loops are already in motion, and we are past the point of no return. If you want my opinion, I generally want to be optimistic. But I also realize that my opinion doesn't carry nearly as much weight as research published by 17 of the world's top scientists and vindicated by modern data analysis. The warning lights on the dashboard are flashing red. We can choose to ignore them, or we can choose to act. The limits to growth was never meant to be a prophecy of doom. It was meant to be a warning. It was a choice. And 50 years later, the question remains. Are we brave enough to make the right one, or will we just keep doing business as usual until the lights go out? To answer that, we have to confront a very uncomfortable truth about human psychology. We are hardwired to ignore threats that are slow, complex, and distant. If a lion jumps out of the bushes, your brain instantly floods your body with adrenaline. You run or you fight. The threat is immediate and the reaction is visceral. But if a scientist tells you that an invisible gas is accumulating in the atmosphere, or that a complex economic feedback loop will cause a famine 20 years from now, your brain doesn't release any adrenaline. You might feel a vague sense of unease, but you don't act. This is called normalcy bias. We assume that because things have been stable for the last 50 years, they will continue to be stable for the next 50. We assume that the grocery store will always be full because in our lifetime it always has been. This normalcy bias is the greatest enemy of the stabilized world scenario. Remember, the MIT researchers identified the stabilized world as the most optimistic outcome. In this scenario, we voluntarily limit our industrial output and curb our consumption to save the system. But think about what that actually asks of us. It asks politicians to campaign on a platform of less. It asks corporations to prioritize sustainability over quarterly profits. It asks you and me to voluntarily lower our standard of living today to prevent a collapse that might happen in 2040. History tells us that humans rarely make that trade. We almost always choose short-term comfort over long-term survival. This psychological inertia is exactly why the KPMG data shows us tracking the business-as-usual line so closely. We are not making the hard choices because, functionally, we are biologically incapable of treating a future threat as a present danger. But let's dig deeper into the comprehensive technology scenario, the one where we hope a genius like Elon Musk or a breakthrough in fusion energy saves us. Why did the original 1972 model and the recent KPMG update suggest that even with high technology, we might still face a decline? It seems counterintuitive. If we have infinite energy and better machines, shouldn't we be fine? The problem lies in what economists call the Jevons paradox. This is a phenomenon where increasing the efficiency with which a resource is used actually increases rather than decreases the rate of consumption of that resource. When we invented more fuel-efficient aircraft engines, we didn't burn less fuel. We just made flying cheaper, so we flew more planes to more places more often and ended up burning more fuel overall. The MIT model accounted for this. It realized that technology often acts as an accelerant. If we find a new, cheaper way to extract lithium or drill for oil, we don't save the surplus. We use it to fuel even more growth, which leads to even more industrial output, which leads to even more pollution. And pollution, according to the business-as-usual model, is the silent killer. In the 1972 simulation, it wasn't just running out of oil that triggered the collapse. It was the accumulation of waste. The model predicted that around the year 2020, the negative impacts of pollution, which today we can read as carbon emissions, microplastics, and soil toxicity, would start to exponentially degrade our ability to produce food. And looking at the world today, that timeline is terrifyingly accurate. We are seeing dead zones in our oceans. We are seeing soil erosion threaten global harvest yields. The jet engine of our economy is sucking in debris, and the turbines are starting to stutter. Let's zoom in on that specific year, 2040. What does the collapse actually look like in the model? It's important to clarify that collapse doesn't necessarily mean the extinction of the human race. The MIT researchers weren't predicting the apocalypse. They were predicting a sharp correction, a return to the mean. In the business-as-usual 2 scenario, the collapse manifests primarily as a breakdown of the complex systems that support our population density. Imagine a world where the cost of fertilizer triples because natural gas is scarce. Suddenly, industrial farming becomes too expensive. Food prices skyrocket. When food prices skyrocket, the average person spends all their money just to eat, meaning they stop buying new phones, new cars, and new clothes. This causes the industrial sector to crash because no one is buying anything. When the industrial sector crashes, jobs vanish. When jobs vanish, the tax base crumbles. When the tax base crumbles, the government can no longer maintain the power grid, the water treatment plants, or the healthcare system. It is a domino effect, and once the first domino falls, the feedback loops we discussed earlier kick into reverse. Instead of a virtuous cycle of growth, we enter a vicious cycle of decline. The population drops not just because of starvation, but because the modern medical system that keeps us alive, the antibiotics, the insulin, the sterile surgical tools, relies on a functioning, high-energy industrial economy to exist. If you unplug the machine, the life expectancy of the human race drops back to pre-industrial levels very quickly. This is the reality of the limit to growth. It is not a political statement. It is a mathematical observation of a finite system. You cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. Eventually, the math wins. However, there is a glimmer of hope that wasn't fully captured in the silicon chips of 1972. The model deals in aggregates, global averages. But humanity is messy, adaptable, and incredibly stubborn. The stabilized world scenario is still technically possible, even if we are late to the party. But it requires a fundamental shift in how we define success. For the last century, success has been measured by GDP, gross domestic product. If the line goes up, we are winning. If the line goes down, we are losing. The Limits to Growth report challenges this fundamental axiom. It suggests that if we want to avoid the drop in 2040, we need to decouple happiness from consumption. We need to build an economy that values resilience over efficiency. What does that look like? It looks like repairing things instead of replacing them. It looks like localizing food production so we aren't dependent on a supply chain that stretches across 3 oceans. It looks like investing in communities rather than commodities. It is a less glamorous world. It is a world with fewer gadgets, slower travel, and perhaps less stuff. But it is a world that can survive. The KPMG analyst, Gaia Harrington, concluded her study with a sentiment that is both haunting and empowering. She noted that we are essentially in a race. We are racing against the timeline of the model. Can we innovate our sustainable technologies and shift our cultural values faster than the feedback loops of pollution and depletion can bring us down? We are currently in the final sprint. The next 10 to 15 years will decide the winner. If we continue with business as usual, the data suggests the decision will be made for us. The laws of physics and biology will impose a correction, and it will not be gentle. But if we can pivot, if we can prove that we are smarter than a computer program from the 1970s thought we were, then we might just pull off the greatest escape act in human history. The year 2040 is no longer a distant point on the horizon. It is right around the corner. It is close enough that you will likely be there to see it. It is close enough that your children will come of age in it. The computer has given us its prediction. The data has confirmed the trajectory. The warning has been sounded. The rest is up to us. So the data is clear, but the solution is not. This leaves us with the ultimate division. On one side, we have the techno-optimists, those who believe fusion energy and AI will break the limits of physics and save us at the buzzer. On the other side, the realists, those who believe we need to consume less, slow down, and return to a simpler life before the system forces us to. Which side are you on? Are you betting on Elon Musk, or are you planting a garden? Let me know your plan in the comments below. I'll be pinning the most interesting argument. And if you want to understand the economic forces that are actually shaping this deadline, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. You don't want to miss what comes next.